He shambled towards them, long arms hanging self-consciously, feeling exposed amid the open expanse of lawn. "I don't mean to be a pain, Hallam," said Verity, "but did you get round to tying the cellar?" Hallam had forgotten. "I'll do that now. Just the steps, and around the wine cellar." Hallam made his way up to the house, noticing that Verity was patiently waiting for him to move out of earshot. He wondered if she had chosen the bench on purpose because it was so difficult to be eavesdropped upon. Creeping along behind the high hedge that divided the grounds from the meadow and public path was almost the only option. Even then you could hardly hear a thing unless they raised their voices. He suspected that the chore was just a way of ensuring that he was well out of the way. If so, she underestimated him. Once he was out of sight, Hallam raced upstairs and into his bedroom. Slowly he opened the window, which looked down over the lawns. Verity and Julius were no more than the size of toy soldiers until he brought up his binoculars. Then he saw her lift one of his logbooks out of her bag and place it on Julius's lap. Hallam's chest contracted. As Julius began to leaf through it, Hallam let his binoculars drop and concentrated instead on hearing. Verity's voice was just audible. Her consonants bounced off the water of the pond and up to the hall window, fairly intact. But Julius's bass tones seemed to fall to pieces and arrived as no more than a low grumbling. Hallam snatched up a scrap of paper and pen and started to transcribe the words regardless of their sense, according to how they sounded. When he was unsure, he made dashes for vowels and dots for consonants. In this way he was free to focus on the evidence of his ears and not be distracted by attempting simultaneously to understand the larger meaning, which could be pieced together later. His pencil moved busily across the page with the urgent concentration of a codebreaker. Locking himself into this familiar procedure helped him control the surge of panic. Eventually scribbling frantically, he saw out of the corner of his eye that Julius had risen and was making his way back towards the hall. Verity got up to follow him, and his transcript came to a sudden halt as she stepped away from the pond. With shaking hands he looked over what he had written, annotating and correcting where he could. The first pertinent line was not on first sight very promising. "You know, Jupy Pin," he said, air humming seriously on Jim. He thought he could make sense of it. "It's not just peeping, it's sick. There's something seriously wrong with him." Then came Julius's answer, but it had been beyond hearing and was very short. The noses returned to Verity, and Helen continued to interpret where necessary, but the next section was remarkably clear as she had raised her voice. "I'm suggesting that he needs help. Psychiatry. He was seen trying to drown himself in the lake in makeup. It's around the whole village. I won't be held responsible." Hallam's notes had become wobbly after that. For all his concentration, Julius had responded, but he had his head down, and again he was incomprehensible. Verity came back on stream, but fuzzily. "You ignored the signs with Anne. Do you want your son to go through the same way?" Then one line of Julian's that Hallam heard because he was shouted. "He's not like her." She raised her voice back at him, and the rest was clear again, even though Julius had got up and moved out of range. "Who could possibly have tipped the papers off if not Hallam? Lucy didn't know, did she?" She paused. "There's no way we can chain the pans. Now, the lakes are a death rat." The notes came to an end as Verity too had moved out of range. Hallam stared at what he had written and tried to assimilate the information, but the garbled phrases circled meaninglessly. With a jolt he remembered that he was supposed to be cleaning the cellar. He rumbled downstairs with the notepaper safe in his pocket and opened the cellar door just as he heard Verity and Julius come inside the hall. He picked up a stiff broom that was leaning in the corner and began to sweep coal dust from the top step down onto the next, slowly descending in the cellar's darkness. "Chain the pans," he thought, sweeping left to right to left. "Chain the pans." Hallam lay in the hammock of Center Point and stared up at the wooden roof. One long leg swung him forwards and back into the bright rectangle of morning sunshine. He listened to the skitter of a bird's feet of the roof and continued to rock. He knew for certain that the end was coming. Julius had confirmed that the tree surgeons were coming tomorrow to cut this oak down, and no village protest would stop it, even if Julius had to stand there by himself and fight them off, or so he claimed. He had never seen his father so impassioned or so determined. Hallam did not have to overhear any conversation to be aware of the suspicion that hung about him. Neither Julius nor Verity were being openly hostile, as there was no evidence linking him with the leak, but even Nicola failed to give him so much as a perfunctory smile when he popped his head into the office, so Hallam kept himself scarce, savoring the last hours in his condemned refuge. He decided to take a second look at the scrap of paper that was still tucked into the pocket of his jeans. He asked himself whether it was conceivable that he might have got it wrong. There was inevitably a margin of error in what he did. He frowned. "There's no way we can change the plans." Could as easily have been framed as a question. Is there no way we can change the plans, as opposed to there is, which radically changed it from a death sentence to a plea for clemency? He entertained doubt. Had he been wrong about everything? Was Verity not the monster he and Lucy thought she was? Was it his fault? Was he just emulating Lucy thoughtlessly and causing all this trouble for himself? Was he drunk on paranoia? Hallam! His legs stiffened and the hammock jerked to a halt. Was that Verity's voice? "Hallam, could you answer me, please?" Her tone was polite, weary. She knew he was there. He got up and stuck his head out of the treehouse. She was alone, staring up, mouth open, shading her eyes. "Hello? Can I come up?" she asked. "I'll come down. Please, I've never been up there before. This is my last chance." He frowned but dropped the ladder down to her. She began to climb up, taking her time, grinning tight-lipped with the effort. Hallam cast his eyes nervously around the treehouse, suddenly conscious of potentially incriminating evidence. He swiftly bundled his fresh logbooks into the chest along with the cigar books and the carving knife. He picked up a ragged porn magazine he had found in the cemetery, but had barely looked at, and tucked it under the bird reference books which were laid ostentatiously by the telescope. He still felt a strong sentimental attachment to the instrument, despite its obsolescence. Verity reached the top and scrambled uncertainly along the bough on all fours. He was pleasantly surprised to find, at a disadvantage up here. With ironic tree-top gallantry, he gave her his hand and helped her inside Center Point. "Thank God for that," she gasped with a little laugh as she crawled in on her knees. "I don't even want to think about going down again." She looked up at him, panting softly, and smiled. He motioned for her to sit on the hammock. She looked at it, back at him with a faint smile, then stood up and banged her head on the roof. "Careful," said Hallam, still concerned about the roof's welfare, even if it was about to be torn out. Half crouching, she went over and lowered herself into the hammock. "Thank you. There's enough room for two if we squeeze up." "That's okay," Hallam said cautiously, and sat down on the floor, cross-legged. "It will be a pity to see this go. Peaceful, isn't it?" He was not in the mood for small talk. She sighed and pressed her knees together, assembling the stepmotherly charade. "I want us to have a talk, Hallam." "Do go on," he replied. "Verity, I only want what's best for your father, and you may be surprised to hear I want them back." It came out of him unplanned. She put aside her unfinished sentence and looked at her nails. "Yes, I expect you do." "I'm curious, did Lucy put you up to this?" "No. Are you disappointed that Julius isn't packing me off to a secure unit?" She glanced up. "What are you talking about?" He smiled. "You must be disappointed that Julius didn't throw me out." Outside, the wind rose, causing the leaves to ripple. Appearing bored, she glanced around her. "I hope I'm not keeping you from your bird-watching." She leant over and uncovered the porn magazine. Hallam contemplated snatching it out of her hands, then thought better of it. She raised her eyebrows with faint surprise. "Girls, I was beginning to wonder." The fact that the pictures were not at all to his taste. They were posed and therefore false. Their sexual conventions were strange and bore no relation to the lives he had watched. Also, the way the model on the cover leered so knowingly into the camera made him feel visible and unerotically sordid. But what was there to say? "Why don't you join me on the hammock? You don't look very comfortable." It was mockery, but a suggestion all the same, and it caused Hallam's throat to dry up. He opened his mouth to speak, but at first nothing came out. Amusement suggested itself around her mouth. "Are we a virgin?" Receiving no response, she rocked herself slowly. "Those notebooks of yours make for fascinating reading in their own way. You must have been very intrepid gathering all that information. Lots of sneaky little drills. You communicate that wonderfully." "Showing Julius didn't work, though, did it?" Hallam managed to inject a bit of triumph into his voice. He was so massively exposed it felt almost liberating. "Do I scare you, Hallam?" "No, you physically repel me." This was a lie, but to Hallam's surprise it sent a shiver through her composure. Was vanity her weak spot? He attacked it with all the violent instinct of the playground. "You're my father's F-bag. What did you expect? With your horrible fat A cheeks and thick ankles?" Hallam saw Verity's anger exposed. This time the expression went out of her eyes and into her mouth. It caused her upper lip to protrude. She looked comically neurotic. For a brief second, Hallam really didn't fear her. He was too fascinated by this transformation. How stupidly hate animated her face, he thought. Unfortunately, however, the moment of Olympian observation did not last very long before it was replaced by something bigger and more biblical in proportion: dread. I know what your mother must have told you about me. Lucy too, no doubt, she said. Those eyes widened now. The upper lip curled. And that's why you hate me and think I'm a whore. I expect you think that I had a part in her dying. Well, your mother was a lying effing B, and she was destroying your father, and she couldn't bear the possibility of him being happy with me. So that's when the lies about me started, the persecution complex, trying to poison everything that Julius and I might have together. Do you know I wish I held your mother under, drowned the lying bee myself, but she did it for me. She killed herself, like the selfish, jealous bee she always was. It was her last attempt to get me out, the sickest and most despicable of them all, and it failed, and there's nothing anyone can prove, nothing. Hallam felt the whole treehouse sway, but the breeze was gentle outside. What was she saying? His mother hadn't told him anything, and neither had Lucy. He could barely focus, his mind swung violently, rebounding from force of her assault. Verity was panting slightly, putting her ardor back under control. What do you think they told me about you? He at last asked, trying to control the tremor in his voice. He had never been the subject of such open and unadulterated adult loathing, but Verity's face had slowly reconfigured. She had thrust the hatred back inside. She was wary again, perhaps regretting, behind that mask of indifference and mild amusement, her outburst. She was not going to give anything more away, and shamefully, Hallam felt an enormous surge of relief. He did not want to know. He belonged in the trees. Well now, she said, and glanced at her small gold wristwatch, you need to pack this place up. A surge of incoherent emotion passed through Hallam. Perhaps it was naivety. It was strong enough. Please, I understand that you hate me, and my dead mother, and my sister, but why do you have to destroy this, and the lakes, and the land? It's done nothing. It's got nothing to do with this. Verity smiled and shrugged. Perhaps I'm not as bad as you think. Perhaps in a funny way I'm on your side. I'll prove it to you. Hallam was baffled, suspicious, unsure what to say. She slipped the magazine back under the book with ostentatious care, then got up, remembering the low roof and time. Making her way out of the tree house sideways, she turned round to face him, reversing into position above the rope ladder. She gingerly set her foot on the first rung, grabbing a nearby branch more for reassurance than practical safety, and it was too slender to save her if she slipped. Then she cautiously lowered herself, squatting awkwardly. Hallam watched her vulnerability and felt himself swing back towards loathing and violence. It tautened his muscles and caused saliva with a metallic taste to flush his mouth. One firm kick in the face and it might all be over. Verity looked up at him warily, but the moment passed and she was on her way down to the ground below. In the morning, Hallam saw from gate watch the tree surgeons arrive in their van. First they had to pass a truculent gathering of 8 local people at the gates. Mr. and Miss Hitchens had even knocked up a couple of placards. Save our lakes. There was jeering, and a young man slick with hair gel, Ginny's brother Gav, whom Hallam recognized, half-heartedly blocked the van's path up the drive. Standing slightly apart and lately arrived with an egg-shaped man with a notebook who looked vaguely familiar. Gav moved to the side after a couple of angry hoots on the van's horn and a loud rev of intent. Toff baiting didn't extend as far as personal injury. Hallam climbed down from gatewatch and was spotted by one of them. Look, it's the Peeping Tom. Hallam did not condescend to pay attention to the hostile laughter, nor to the waves of the journalist who was attempting to draw him over to talk. Nobody told us his job was controversial, said one of the surgeons as they unpacked their chainsaws. You're all right, said Carl. It's just locals with nothing better to do. Carl clearly felt guilty about having to play a part in this. He avoided Hallam's eye when all Hallam wanted to do was give him a smile of reassurance. Julius was fetched together. The men went up to the lake. Hallam was not invited and didn't want to go. He went up to his bedroom instead. The chest was on the floor of his bedroom. The badger pelt flopped on top of it. His equipment suddenly looked quaint and childish out of its proper setting. He sat down on his bed and tried to wait, but it was no use. He had to see what was being done. He was jogging up towards the passageway between the stables and the cottage, worried that he might miss the felling altogether, when he heard an ambulance siren and the high rev of its engine as it negotiated the back drive at speed. He pounded through the passageway, his panting amplified and echoing around him until he burst out, meeting the crowd of former demonstrators now running towards the base of the oak tree. His father, Carl, and a tree surgeon were kneeling around a prone body. The ambulance screeched to a halt on the drive, blocking Hallam's view. Paramedics climbed out and headed up towards the crowd. Hallam followed. It was the other tree surgeon. His right arm had been nearly removed to the soldier. The saw was just a few feet away, its chain broken and splattered with blood. Hallam went up to the base of the tree where the chainsaw had bitten into the trunk. 2 bent 6-inch nails, still shiny new, protruded from the wound. Only on close inspection did Hallam see that the rest of the trunk was full of them also. The nail heads had been blackened to camouflage the glint of metal. They lifted the shuddering man onto the stretcher. The egg-shaped journalist asked the paramedics which hospital they were going to. The hushed crowd began to disperse back down the drive, shooed away by Carl. Then the other tree surgeons stopped and screamed to them, "Whichever one of you bastards spiked this tree, are you happy now? An innocent man doing his job." Julius and Hallam entered the passage on their way back towards the hall. By the time they emerged on the other side, Hallam was convinced. "Dad, it was Verity." Julius stopped and looked at him closely. "I know she's been trying to tell you I'm mad, but I'm not. She is. I know you're not." Julius took him greatly by the arm and walked him back into the hall. "Come on into the office. Nicola's not in today." Hallam followed, reassured by his father's calmness. "Sit down," said Julius. Hallam did so, and Julius sat opposite. He opened a drawer and took out a checkbook. He wrote £4,000 on it and then offered it to Hallam. Hallam didn't understand, although of course he took it. "What's this for?" "Hallam, this is to discharge my obligations. You are not ill, and that's why I hold you fully responsible for your actions. Now listen carefully. You are moving out of the hall. Please don't come back or contact us again, although I don't mind if you send a forwarding address for mail." "Dad, I didn't do it. I appreciate there is no firm evidence. However, I'm calling a taxi. It will arrive in 20 minutes and take you wherever you want. You've got some change, haven't you?" Julius picked up the phone and dialed and did not look at Hallam again. Hallam stood up groggily. £4,000? Why on earth for? 0 he could understand. 50,000 maybe. He reflected on the ineffable mystery of his father's thought processes. He could hear a phone ringing in a distant office. He turned to go. "And don't think this will stop the development," Julius called after him. In fact, quite the contrary. The taxi pulled away down the drive with the chest and suitcase and the book back. Hallam, sitting in the back, had not said goodbye to Verity. She was nowhere to be seen until they were sweeping past the main door. And he glanced up at the bay window, and above it, and glimpsed her face looking down at him. She wore a faint smile and raised her palm. In benediction or mocking farewell, he could no longer guess, and anyway, the hall was now a guttering image of red brick in the wing mirror. All Hallam could do was stare out at the green lawn, flickering through the line of trees, and then the taxi went out through the gates, and he left the grounds, he assumed forever. 5. Hallam kept his head low as he trotted along the roof, making sure he could not be seen from the tenement windows of the neighbors across the yard. Pinched rooftops on either side kept him largely obscured for the length of the valley gutter, until he hopped over a bolted trapdoor above the block's communal stairwell and nimbly ascended the steep, lead-lined join between two stretches of slate. There was no avoiding exposure here on the ridge, so he paused a moment, shading his eyes in an innocent pose, to admire the view over Edinburgh's medieval old town. The castle squatted in the distance, visible over tall buildings flanking the Royal Mile. He could theoretically be seen by hundreds of people up here, but he knew that in his boiler suit he would not attract a second glance. Mass exposure conferred its own kind of anonymity. The rooftops of the city were constantly populated by repairmen, drunken students, window cleaners, satellite dish installers, not to mention burglars, a ragged community living among the pigeon crap and pollution, and all of them in their own way like him. The 5 years since he had left Tranby Hall had altered his appearance. A light wind ruffled his now short hair. His long arms had acquired more sinuous strength, and his fingers, too, had thickened, and the pads on his palms had roughened like those of a gymnast. His skin had lost the milkiness of its acne-resistant teenage years, and the light of the early evening sky showed that his face had filled out a little. As he squinted towards the dropping sun, a frown mark shaped like the Greek letter pi appeared between his eyes. Another new addition, but some things never change. He pattered softly down the other side of the double-pitched roof with fast, tiny steps and the same bandy-legged gait of old. He paused behind a large tin-pot chimney stack, kneeled on his haunches, and looked over to where her bathroom window had been left open a few inches. Steam drooled out of the thin aperture, carrying with it the scent of sweet almond oil as it sucked away over the roof tiles. He felt a familiar twinge in his stomach, savored it, and crept forward, every step measured, soundless. He brought himself right up to the window frame, mindful not to cast a shadow within. Tenderly he curved his body round the frame, slowly relaxing his muscles and resting the underside of his arm along the metal lintel. They were made for each other, the window and him. They fitted. Hallam closed his eyes and listened to the gentle sop of warm water just those short feet below him. He felt the warmth of the steam leaking up over the side of his face, and he locked its memory away, helplessly in love with this moment. He opened his eyes again, puppyish with ardor, and moved back down into a crouch to bring his eyes level with the sill. Steam streamed over his ears. as he peered below the misted pane. She was there, lying in her bath below him, rosy and inert. Her head was out of sight, but he could still see her whole body from the neck down, white, simple breasts and carved hips amid the soapy water. He was moved to compassion by her vulnerability. He smiled sadly at this situation, him hustled by the cool Edinburgh wind out here, her safe and secure within. At this moment the barrier between them, voyeur and subject, seemed so cruel, and yet he had to remind himself it was insuperable. After all, voyeurism had its responsibilities. Hallam did not regard what he was doing as sleazy. Until he had come upon the graffiti over Center Point in his previous life, he had never even associated the comically dated term peeping Tom with what he did. Where was the peeping in his almost scientific dedication to observation and recording, a close-packed notepad always primed in his back pocket, not to mention his cultivated sense of levity in sexual matters? It was not necessarily sex or human drama that interested Hallam and his subjects. Usually it was the quiet moments that appealed to him, hearing the steady breathing of their sleep, or the sounds of their restlessness, or just following the pottering domestic activities that somehow managed to encapsulate the flavor of their private existence. He felt no more arousal watching a couple making love through a skylight, he had convinced himself, than a primatologist, say, watching two gibbons mate. Neither possessed much dignity when dispassionately observed. There was more to it than that, though. Once he had tried to read all sorts of possible meanings into these body letters, body words, but the frustration eventually put him off to the point where he shirked observation of it altogether. In reality, the sexual act was a crossword he could not solve, in a language he did not understand. Kate, however, was a special case. He felt drawn to her in an unusually compelling way, and this was precisely what the rules of distance were for. Hallam thought of the rules as a professional code of conduct. They allowed him to pursue his calling without harming or disturbing others, and it provided a coherent framework that helped curb the perils of obsession. Besides psychological protection, they also reduced the risk of brushes with the police, although the law was strangely impotent in matters relating to voyeurism, even including its distant and, in Hallam's view, utterly repulsive cousin stalking. The rules formulated by himself were as follows. Firstly, they forbade him any sexual contact with his subjects, not that this was even conceivable. Secondly, they decreed that there be no social interaction with the subject beyond that which was practically necessary. Thirdly, the voyeur should not use his privileged knowledge and information to interfere in the life of the subject, even if it did appear to be in their best interests. Lastly, but sacred among all the rules, was that the voyeur should never make his activities known to a subject, under any circumstances. There were certain amendments, of course. Hallam did allow himself to use the things he learnt from his subjects for own personal gain, so long as they did not harm the subject. Theoretically, one could break the rules to intervene in a subject's life if that life was in immediate danger, although this was not a moral imperative. Hallam believed that the voyeur, being dedicated to the observation of life and being by necessity invisible, operated outside the normal scheme of things and consequently did not bear the same responsibilities as other people. Hallam had no doubt that many people would find this code and the whole voyeuristic calling disgusting and parasitic. Perhaps they would be horrified that he did not report occasional cases of domestic violence that he witnessed or heard going on within homes he passed over. But what could he do? And besides, he was not alone. The 20th century had brought out the voyeuristic impulse well into the cultural mainstream, in many ways for the better, and the 21st only promised to elevate it even higher in the lives and experiences of the people. Hallam saw himself as the product of a wider cultural movement, although of course he belonged to a different league entirely from the slack-mouthed telewatchers and internet browsers below. He took note of the times of all his subjects' favorite television programs and organized his own viewing schedules to avoid them, aside from the boredom of watching someone gaping at some supposedly real-life soap like Big Brother or whatever else was popular at the time. There was repulsion, too. The few times that Hallam had stuck around to watch, he had been haunted afterwards by his subjects' seemingly lifeless bodies and faces, eyes glittering in the television's glow. It made him feel as if he was looking at himself. Occasionally, Hallam wondered if he might be slightly mad. But he knew that he was not, chiefly because he possessed doubts. When he had asked himself 100 times if these rules were merely the intellectual dressing to help him feel more comfortable about his vice, but he answered himself at least it was a victimless vice. It was not invasive. Besides, he paid for his pleasure with risk, although of course this soon became part of the pleasure itself. Hallam never needed to ask himself whether the danger was worth it, as he prepared to jump across a 30-foot plunge between tenements to check on the daily rituals of occupant of top flat 2 Urquhart's Close. That would have been the missing the point. He cared for his subjects. He forgave them their unspeakable table manners even when they ate alone. He was in a sense their guardian angel. The tragedy was that they would never know he was there. The girl jolted upright in her bath, causing the water to splash over the sides and onto the terracotta floor of the bathroom. Hallam instinctively ducked, and his reverie was blown away across the gray city stacks. Had she somehow sixth sensed his presence? Of course not, he reassured himself, and concentrated on regulating his breathing. He of all people knew the myth of the itchy neck or burning sensation that fiction writers gave their characters when they felt they were being watched. It did not exist, or if it did, then it had been bred out of the modern city dweller. People were constantly under watch. They even wanted to be watched, by security cameras at the very least. It gave them peace of mind. Cautiously, Hallam brought an eye to bear again, just in time to see her rise out of the bath and reach over for a towel, a little stream of water pouring off her pudenda. Then he heard the telephone ring twice until it was picked up by an answering machine. She paused, wrapping the towel around herself. Together, she and Hallam listened to the recording. Messages, please, for Kate Breck. A bleep. He smiled dotingly at her brevity. Then on came the voice that Hallam loathed, smug East Coast with an excusable drawl. Yeah, hi, Kate. It's Alice Dare here. She was already racing across the hallway to the bedroom to pick up the phone, so keen with that childish absence of shame that he had observed so many times in people who were alone. Huffing his disapproval, Hallam pattered back up the join, over the angled loft and across to an inward pivoting skylight. It, too, is partially open, one of the blessings of the warm weather. He put his ear close and heard her voice. It was calmer and more casual than her indecorous sprint to the phone, but still it failed to disguise her excitement and flirtatious inclinations. You just caught me in the bath, Al. I'm dripping all over the carpet. Oh, no, don't worry, I'm fine. So, do you still want to go meet tonight? For Jade's sake, have some dignity, Hallam thought. He's no good for you. Oh, she said, pathetically disappointed. So the weekend's out as well. Really? I suppose so. What a surprise. So that's the second time he's canceled. Okay, tomorrow then. No, that's okay. See you. She put down the phone and sat on the bed, thinking. Her black hair hung limply round her beautiful flushed cheeks, and ended just below her sharply drawn jaw. Helen loved the harshness in her face, the downward curve of her mouth and arched eyebrows. He thought he could see what lay beneath. A bead of water slid down between her shoulder blades. She ran her fingers up the nape of her neck and shook the damp locks. Her sigh caused Hallam to rise up and move away. Watching was never easy. It was getting dark by the time he returned to his part of the old town and put his key in the outside padlock. He lifted the rooftop skylight, perched on the edge, and dangled his legs inside. Then, with a lithe twisting motion, he turned and dropped out of sight except for his fingers, which had snapped shut on the skylight sill. They flexed once, twice, as his body swung gently beneath and let go. Helen fell between two wooden rafters and landed feet first on his mattress. He bounced gamely on it, then hopped off the beams that supported the loft, brushing his hands with satisfaction. Home! He lifted up a pole with a metal hook on the end and used it to shut the skylight above him and push home the lock. The skylight's blind was down, as always. He did not like to wake up in the morning light. Just the idea of being observable from above was enough to stop him falling asleep. The journey from Kate's place to his over the rooftops was relatively short and simple. It was part of his flat's appeal. Besides that, it suited him perfectly, small enough to be affordable for a young man with a reasonable job in the charity sector, and some money from a will, a loft above it big enough to put into a mattress, and neighbors, students and young professionals mostly, who took no interest in him whatsoever, and of course the skylight. He turned off the loft's light bulb, which he had softened with a burgundy shade, and disappeared down the stepladder to the flat below. The dim light revealed that the loft was almost completely bare. A fridge door opened and closed, and Hallam climbed back up again, holding a bag containing a carton of orange juice and a cornish pastry, purchased at a petrol station up the road. He lay back on the thin mattress, which was supported by some plywood laid over the beams. He took a bite out of the pastry and helped it down with the juice. It had been a good day by his standards. Chewing idly, he listened to the rising wind as it washed over the roof. It was barely quiet tonight, but when the gusts picked up, he could feel the whole loft shudder and the wooden rafters creak. He closed his eyes and allowed the smell of the dust and dry wood to bring him relaxation and escape. He would fill his logbook later. With a heavy arm, he plonked down the carton and shoved the pastry away, curling up fully clothed, already willing himself to dream about the trees. Hallam said good morning to his boss as he walked into the offices of Cancer Action and went to his desk. Morning, Hallam, replied Kate without looking up. She was sipping on a mug of coffee and perusing the latest issue of a newish Scottish society magazine, North Britain, which was aimed at the nation's rich and glamorous but sold mainly to Americans of Scottish ancestry. "Get up to anything last night?" he called over casually, turning on his computer terminal. "Pretty boring," she replied, then looked up at him and smiled. "Couldn't be going out. Staying in for a soak. Rather pleasant, actually." "Sounds nice," replied Hallam. He felt affection for the small lies and half-truths that buffered his subjects' public and private lives. "Men, would she never learn? They're not worth it," he said. She smiled ruefully in agreement, then suddenly frowned. "What aren't worth it?" "Evenings out midweek. They're draining." "Oh," replied Kate, slowly going back to her magazine. "Yes, Hallam knew he shouldn't play these stupid little games. It was hardly healthy for someone who intended to observe the rules of distance forever. Still, how could Kate ever guess that she was his prime subject? "Come over here for a second, would you?" Hallam shrugged off his jacket, hung it on the back of his chair, and went across to Kate's desk. He leaned over to look at an article that she had circled in the magazine's gossip column. "Have a quick read of this." Hallam quickly scanned the story. It mentioned that a certain Dorothy Carter, née Mackenzie, was returning to live in Perthshire after an absence of over 20 years following the death of her American husband, the New York-based merchandiser Frank. She was reported to have said that she wanted to be back in her hometown and had recently been treated for cancer in the States. It also mentioned that her son Gordon owned an art gallery in Edinburgh. "Coming home to die, maybe?" said Hallam. "You never know," replied Kate. "Her husband's American, which means that it should be simple to finding out the details of his will. See what else there is, any family history of illness, donations to charities, you know the sort of thing. Check what we've sent our legacy leaflet to their solicitors. Might be nothing, but still. What about the son?" "Gordon Carter? He lives in Edinburgh, all right. I've heard of him. We should sound him out. It pays to be discreet, so remember the code. Softly, softly. No direct sales pitch. Their initiative, no pressuring." I know. Kate ripped out the page and passed it over, smiling up at him. "Thanks, Hallam. You're a brick. How are you getting along with the copy for the leaflet?" "Fine. Photo-wise, I thought we could get some cute pensioners with a younger generation, protective hand on the shoulder kind of thing." "Yeah, lots of smiles, no references to illness." Her attention was back on her computer screen. He turned briskly on his heel, still savoring the cool pleasure of their professional relationship, the way she trusted him with his work, the slick efficiency of their discussions, the effortless decision-making. He smiled to himself and tingled in the way a normal person might remember the night before. At his desk, he quickly logged on and brought up the Public Records Office website at the New York State Capitol, Albany. He tapped the name Frank Carter. Up rolled the details of the will. It was as simple as that. Hallam sucked in his breath and he scrolled through the document. The man had been rich, and it had all gone to his wife. By mid-afternoon, Hallam had built up a portfolio with information on the Carters, covering a financial state of the family, Frank's death, and discreet press references to the bouts of illness that Dorothy had been suffering from recent years. Some of the information came from the press cuttings, but most of the stuff on Gordon from a young gay man, Stuart Campbell, who worked in fundraising at the Edinburgh Festival, obviously considered Hallam a closet case in need of bringing out. This entailed occasional excruciating evenings at gay bars where the clientele were apt to stare at nervously grinning young men, but the information gleaned on rich donors to the arts, and general gossip made it worthwhile. Gordon Carter was often mentioned for the decadence of his gallery's private viewing parties, and the invariable prettiness of the featured female artists. Both pointed towards considerable independent income. His name had come up in the last couple of weeks, Hallam seemed to recall, while he had been on the case of a degenerate Anglo-Scottish aristocrat, Ian Hamilton, who liked to slum with artsy crowd and possessed a family tree afflicted with right cancers. At the bars frequented by this crowd, Hallam was the duly dressed, vaguely defeated-looking young man of no consequence, who was jostled or crowded unobtrusively into proximity with other people's conversations. Gordon, it had to be assumed, would eventually be the beneficiary of the estate of the tragic event of Dorothy's death, as she had no other close relatives still living. As far as was known, her donations to charity had never been substantial and usually only extended to attending the odd society ball. Hallam bounded over to Kate's desk. "Hey, Kate, Dorothy Carter is very rich and almost certainly on her way out." "What's she dying from?" "One of the big cancers. She's had several operations without success, it seems. Any idea of time frame?" "She's unlikely to last the year, is what Gordon told a friend." "Is she of sound mind?" "No senility, quite sharp still, apparently." Kate smiled. "Well, that sounds promising. Good work, Hallam." Hallam smiled back. Only 4 hours intensive labor, and he had already earned another smile. This was easy. "I'm just going to pop by the gallery. Won't be long." He returned to his desk and picked a Cancer Action collecting tin while humming a tune. "Hold it, what's that you're humming?" "The Afro-Cuban All-Stars. I'm out on the album." "You are?" Kate laughed. "So am I. How did you hear about them?" Through crouching by your window, listening to you playing the album, thought Hallam. I saw a preview of the documentary and ordered it on the net. Much better than Buena Vista Social Club, in my humble opinion. Actually, I'm thinking of doing some Cuban dance lessons. You are? If I could find a partner. Hallam couldn't believe he'd just said that. He was extending her an invitation, however indirect and unlikely to be taken up, and that was pushing the boundaries of the rules. But he had watched her dancing in her flat, and it had been a revelation. Solitary dancing was so much more erotic and unfettered than the self-conscious posturings in nightclubs that he had seen from glimpses of other people's late-night TV sets. He had loved her sweetly narcissistic shimmies in front of the mirror. Kate frowned. You know, I've been trying to convince this guy Alasdair to come and do them with me, but he's so stubborn. Alasdair? Asked Hallam mildly, not wanting to sound intrusive, but noting with ambiguous relief that she had sidestepped his hugely irresponsible invitation. Alasdair? He asked mentally. You mean the one who plucks his nostril hair in your bedroom when you go to the toilet? Sort of ex-boyfriend. I'm meeting them this evening. Well, enjoy yourself. Kate rubbed the back of her neck. Hallam, I hope you won't mind me asking you a favor, but, well, this is a bit personal. Hallam looked sympathetic. His subjects usually found him understanding because he was already familiar with their private preoccupations. He never went so far as to casually touch on, say, Kate's worrying predilection for gorging on chocolate or masturbating while weeping on a sofa, but he was able to pick up tips like her bedside reading, musical taste, and the rest. Seemingly coincidental shared interests could have a magical effect on predisposing a person towards him. Everyone was superstitious at heart about personal chemistry. It was a repressed belief in fate. It's just that whenever I meet him, things tend to get a bit out of control. I know he's no good for me, and I've told him it's all over, but it would help if someone else was there to keep things at a certain level. You want me to come along? Would you mind? Have you got something on? I can put it off. Wise, Hallam thought. My social life is a husk. This was amazing luck. He lifted up a hand as she began to protest. I wouldn't offer if I didn't want to. She smiled and touched his hand. Thanks. I would ask a girlfriend, but I know this sounds awful. The thing is, he's very good looking.